Why would every man in Silverline stand dead silent around the rancher's new bride, a silence that would cost 9 of them their lives before the week was out? Not one man in that town would sell her flour, shoe her horse, or meet her eyes at the church door, and not one of them, watching her from a careful distance for 2 silent weeks, understood that the gray drifter sleeping in her husband's barn had ridden 400 miles because he already knew exactly what 9 of Silverline's most powerful sons were about to attempt at first light. Her name was Elowen. His name was Ridge Calloway. Her husband of 6 months. A rancher who still couldn't get a straight answer out of anyone as to why his own neighbors wouldn't look at his wife. And this is the story of the autumn of 1878 in the high country of the young state of Colorado, when a debt 11 years old finally rode out of Silverline's past to collect itself in blood, and a gray old gunslinger stood in a doorway. If you found your way to this fire tonight, tell me where you're riding in from down in the comments. I like knowing how far a story travels before we're even done telling it. And if the notion of 9 armed men riding out at dawn to bury a rancher's wife and finding a man waiting on that porch they never once counted on is the kind of thing that keeps you here to the end, stay close. Now let's go back 3 years, to a rented room above a Denver dry goods store, where a quiet young rancher sat down at a borrowed desk and wrote a letter he never expected anyone to answer. Ridge Calloway was 24 the winter he wrote it, and he'd already learned the particular loneliness of a man who does everything right and still comes home to an empty house. He'd inherited 800 acres of high pasture from an uncle who died without children of his own. Good grazing land, tucked against the eastern slope of the range above Silverline, water rights clean and undisputed, timber enough to keep a roof mended for 2 lifetimes. He ran cattle well and kept his fences tight and his word tighter, the kind of rancher other ranchers trusted at a handshake without needing a lawyer in the room. But he'd buried his mother the year before, his father 3 years before that, and there wasn't a soul left on the place to call his name at supper. So he did what a certain kind of practical, unromantic man did in those years when the arithmetic of a life stopped adding up. He wrote to a matrimonial correspondence bureau out of Kansas City, described his acreage and his character with more honesty than flattery, and asked whether any woman answering their notices might consider a rancher who could offer land, decency, and very little conversation. He got one within 6 weeks, in a hand so careful and even it looked almost printed, from a young woman calling herself Elowen Marsh, 20 years old, presently employed as a seamstress and part-time governess in the household of a Denver mining supply merchant, and a husband who would not ask more of her past than she was willing to give. Ridge read that line 4 times the night it arrived. He did not know, not then, what it cost a person to write a sentence like that. Careful as a fence line drawn around ground nobody was allowed to cross. He wrote back that he would ask nothing she didn't offer freely, and it was, though neither of them knew it, yet the truest promise either would make that whole year, and the one that would matter most before the next autumn was out. Her letters that followed were plain, unadorned things, written in that same careful, even hand, and Ridge kept every one of them tied with twine in a cigar box on his bedside shelf, reading them over some nights the way another man might read scripture. "You ask what I look for in a husband," she wrote him once, in March. "And I confess I have thought harder about that question than any other in my life. I do not need a rich man or a handsome one. I need a man whose word once given does not move. I have known men whose promises shifted with the weather, and I have decided I would rather live poor and cold than marry another one of them." Ridge had written back that he could not promise her riches or much conversation of an evening, but that a promise from him, once made, had never once moved, not for weather nor for anything else, and that he intended it to stay that way. He meant it as an ordinary courtesy. He did not yet know how many times that particular promise would be tested before the year was through, nor how much it would come to mean to a woman who had spent 5 years watching the whole world break its word to her. They corresponded through that winter and spring, practical letters mostly, about the price of beef and the length of a Colorado winter, and Ridge found himself thinking, at odd hours out mending fence, about a quality in her letters he couldn't quite name, a carefulness, a way of answering every question exactly as far as it went. She never once mentioned a father or a mother. She never mentioned where she'd been raised, only that it was east of the Mississippi and long behind her. Ridge, being the sort of man who took a fence line at face value, never pressed, and in April of 1878, he rode down to Denver in a borrowed buggy and watched Elowen Marsh step off the platform. Could have said, with any honesty, what they were about to walk into. What Ridge did not know, what Elowen had decided. Somewhere in the long nights of composing those careful letters, she would never tell any man, unless the truth cornered her into it, was that Elowen Marsh had not always been her name, and the past she'd left east of the Mississippi. It was a good deal closer than that, and it was riding straight toward the middle of her new marriage on the back of a tired gray mule that hadn't even left its last town yet. She had been born Elowen Rourke in the spring of 1855, the only child of a federal deputy marshal named Josiah Rourke, and a schoolteacher named Naomi, who had married him against her own family's wishes, because Josiah Rourke had spent years running down horse thieves and mail robbers across 2 territories before he was given a duty most lawmen spent whole careers grateful to avoid. Under federal commission, he became the man sent for when a district needed an execution carried out by someone with no local grudge settle and no local kin to protect. The newspapers, on the rare occasions they mentioned him, called him the territorial hangman, a title he hated and never used himself. He believed a rope pulled by an honest hand under lawful sentence was a mercy set against what usually happened when a raw territory took justice into its own fists, the mob, the bonfire, the drag behind a horse, and he carried out that grim, exacting duty for 11 years without pleasure and without apology. In the autumn of 1867, when Elowen was 12, her father packed a single bag, kissed her mother goodbye, and rode north into a stretch of high country where a mining camp called Silverline had been rotten to its foundations. He was gone 6 weeks. He came home gray in a way he hadn't been gray when he left, and he would not, for the rest of his life, speak one word to his wife or his daughter about what he had done in that camp. Elowen remembered only fragments, her mother's face going pale over a letter, a family friend saying the word Silverline in a hushed voice at supper, and her father's hand coming down flat and hard enough to make the plates jump, the only time she ever saw him lose his temper. She was 12 years old. She filed the name away the way a child files any word that makes the grown people around her go quiet, and she did not think of Silverline again for 11 years, until a wagon rolled her and her new husband up a dusty grade and a weathered sign nailed to a post. Read that same word. Have explained to Ridge if her life had depended on it. The rest of what happened to the Rourke family is not a kind rest, and it is the reason Elowen Marsh existed at all by the time she stepped off that Denver platform. Josiah Rourke's work made him more enemies than any one man could count, patient enemies, the kind who nurse a grudge for years, waiting on the day a hangman's protection finally thins out enough to let old business get finished. That day came in 1872 in Cheyenne, when a federal circuit judge was found shot dead in his own study, and within a week, a set of forged letters, a stolen pistol matched to Rourke's own caliber, and 3 paid witnesses had put Josiah Rourke in the dock for a murder he had not committed. Elowen was 17. She sat through a 4-day trial in a courtroom that smelled of wood smoke and wet wool, watching a prosecutor who never once looked her father in the eye lay out a case built on paper that later inquiries would prove had been forged in 3 different hands. Could not possibly have all been true at once. Her father testified in his own defense on the 3rd day, his voice level, his hand still, and told the jury the same plain truth Elowen had heard him tell her mother 100 times across their supper table, and that he had not killed Judge Voss and never would have, because a man who had spent his whole career upholding the law's authority did not throw that authority away over a private grudge. 12 men who never once looked him in the eye returned a verdict inside 11 minutes, and 8 months later, on a cold gray morning in Cheyenne, Elowen stood in a crowd of strangers and watched her father hang from a federal gallows for a crime the honest men who'd worked beside him knew in their bones he never committed. He found her face in that crowd in his last moments, and the last thing Josiah Rourke ever said to his daughter, spoken quiet across a distance of 30 feet of hostile silence, was that she was to hold her head up, whatever came after. One of those honest men was a young federal deputy named Ferrin, who had ridden as Josiah Rourke second on 8 assignments across 2 territories, including, though Elowen did not yet know it, and he rarely spoke of it, the 6 silent weeks in Silverline in 1867. Ferrin had an alibi solid enough to clear his old partner in an afternoon, except the men who wanted Rourke silenced had planned for exactly that kind of loyalty and made certain, through channels Ferrin spent years afterward trying and failing to trace, that his testimony never once reached that courtroom. He arrived in Cheyenne 2 days after the hanging, stood over a grave that should never have needed digging, and made a promise to a dead man's headstone he intended to keep for as long as it took. He would be 46 the autumn. He finally kept it gray-headed by then and slowed just enough that most men who met him assumed, wrongly, he was nothing more than a tired old drifter riding a worn-out mule toward wherever old drifters go, to finish out their days. Naomi Rourke died of a fever 2 years after the hanging, and Elowen, 18 and entirely alone, did the only thing a young woman with a hanged man's name could do. If she wanted any decent future at all, she took her mother's maiden name, told no one where she'd come from, and built a small, careful, invisible life in Denver. 5 years of quiet work and quieter grief, until a letter arrived from a rancher describing 800 acres of good grazing land and a promise to ask nothing she didn't offer freely. She married him in April, believing for the first time in 5 years that there might be a version of her life that didn't require watching over her own shoulder. She had no way of knowing the ground his uncle had left him, sat 11 miles from the one town on earth where her father's name was carved in blood and rope, and 11 buried years into the memory of every family living there. If frontier stories about people who wouldn't back down move you, tap join beside the channel name and become a member. It's how these tales keep coming. Reverend Amos Teague married them on a bright, ordinary Saturday in the second week of April in the small white church at the edge of Silverline, with a scattering of Ridge's neighbors filling the front pews and Elowen standing in a borrowed blue dress with her chin lifted the way. She will not let this particular day be swallowed by fear of what might come after. Teague's voice that afternoon carried nothing but warmth, his hand steady on the worn family Bible he'd carried into that pulpit for a decade, and if Elowen noticed, standing at the altar rail, the faintest hesitation in his eyes when Ridge gave her name for the record, Elowen of Denver, lately of the East, she told herself it was nothing. A trick of the church's dim afternoon light, and let Ridge slide the plain gold band onto her finger without a shadow crossing her face. They rode out to the ranch that evening in a wagon strung with a few sprigs of late mountain aster. Some neighbor woman had tucked behind the seat, and for 2 full weeks afterward, before the silence properly began, that she had finally ridden clean out of her own past and into a life nobody in it would ever recognize. Those first 2 weeks were, in their own quiet way, the happiest Elowen had known since she was a girl of 11, sitting at her mother's supper table. Ridge was not a talkative man, but he was an attentive one, learning the particular sound of her step on the porch boards, teaching her to sit a horse properly on the high pasture trails, listening without once pressing when she went quiet over some memory she wasn't ready to share. She learned the ranch the way she'd once learned a new stitch pattern methodically, thoroughly, until she could have found her way blindfolded from the spring house to the north fence line, and in the evenings, over supper, she was still teaching herself to cook at altitude. She and Ridge fell into the easy, undemanding companionship of 2 careful people, slowly deciding they might, after all, have found something worth trusting. It was into that fragile, new, unguarded happiness that the silence of Silverline first began creeping, one averted glance at a time, and it was that happiness, more than anything else, that made the 2 weeks which followed so much harder to bear. Silverline itself, on the ordinary market morning, it finally showed its true face, looked entirely too ordinary to disarm a woman who'd been carrying a cold feeling in her chest since the day the wagon first climbed that dusty grade. A tidy, prosperous little place of perhaps 400 souls at 8,000 feet. A mercantile and a blacksmith's forge, and a small white church, an assay office that did more business than the town's modest size suggested, and a 2-story bank building that was by a wide margin. She and Ridge tied up in front of the mercantile a little before 10 that first market morning, Ridge with a supply list in his coat pocket, Elowen carrying the household egg money in a small reticule, and they walked in together. The man behind the counter, Vane Marlin, a lean, watchful storekeeper in his early 40s, who also served as the town's postmaster and notary, weighing out flour and filing land papers with the same unhurried precision, looked up at the bell over the door with the ordinary welcome of a man who'd sold nails. That first morning, nothing in his face changed. He did not yet know her name was anything other than Elowen Calloway, rancher's wife, and he filled their order and made their change with nothing more than the mild, distracted courtesy any storekeeper shows a new face in town. It was 2 weeks later, on a Homestead Renewal errand that should have been the dullest 10 minutes of Ridge's whole autumn, that everything in Silverline changed at once, but we are getting ahead of it, because those 2 weeks in between were their own kind of hard. For those first 2 weeks, the town simply would not look at her. It was subtle at first, the sort of thing Elowen told herself she was imagining, a woman at the mercantile counter, finding a reason to step outside the moment Elowen came in, a knot of men on the boardwalk who fell quiet as she passed and did not resume talking until she'd gone a good 20 yards on. Hollis Dray, the blacksmith, a broad, sun-scarred man who'd shod half the horses in the county without ever once turning away a customer, told her, his back already turned toward the fire, that he was too backed up with work to take on anything new. Though Ridge could plainly see through the open doors of the smithy that Dray had exactly nothing else on his docket that afternoon, and on the Sunday Ridge finally convinced her to come to services, Reverend Amos Teague, a thin, gray-templed man of perhaps 50 who had married them himself with every appearance of ordinary warmth, stood at the church door afterward, shaking every hand in the departing congregation except hers, his own hand withdrawing at the last possible second, his eyes fixed somewhere over her shoulder the whole time. Reverend Ridge's voice had an edge in it that hadn't been there 2 weeks before. "My wife is standing right in front of you. I know she is, Mr. Calloway." Teague's voice barely rose above a whisper, and there was something in it that was not quite contempt, though it looked, from the outside, exactly like contempt. "I know exactly who she is." He walked away before either of them could ask what that meant, and Ridge stood on the church steps with his jaw working and no words coming. Nobody was cruel to Elowen. Not exactly. Nobody shouted. Nobody said an unkind word to her face. It was worse than cruelty in its way, 100 small refusals accumulating into a weight she carried into every room, until the 11-year-old dread she'd spent 5 years teaching herself to bury began, in the privacy of her own new home, to come apart at the seams she'd sewn so carefully shut. Ridge tried the mercantile again. Alone this time, no Elon, along to make Marlin flinch. Marlin wouldn't meet his eyes any better without her present than with her. There's things a man doesn't stir up, Ridge, old things. Best left buried. She's my wife, Vane. If there's something buried, I'd like to know what it is before it buries her. Marlin only shook his head and turned back to his shelves, and Ridge rode home that evening angrier than he'd been in years, angry at a town that wouldn't explain itself, and angrier, underneath that, at his own helplessness, the particular gnawing helplessness of a man who loves someone. The danger got its name on the 14th day, on the dullest errand of the whole autumn. Every rancher holding land under the old federal survey was required once a year to file a short renewal at the land office confirming the names of record for a homestead, and since Vane Marlin held the county's notary commission, along with his postmaster's stamp, that renewal crossed his mercantile counter same as everything else in Silverline. Ridge filled it out in 5 careless minutes, the way he'd filled it out every October since his uncle died, listing the acreage, the water rights, and in the line asking for the names of all persons holding interest in the homestead, his own name, and his wife's Elowen Rourke Calloway, exactly as she'd quietly insisted he write it the one time. Months before, she'd let slip to him that Marsh wasn't the whole of her name, and that if paperwork ever demanded the truth, she would rather it came from her own hand than a lie caught later. Vane Marlin read that line, and his pen stopped moving, and the color went out of his face the way water goes out of a cracked jug, slow. Then, all at once, he had been 9 years old in 1867. He had stood in this very street and watched a federal hangman named Josiah Rourke put a rope around his own father's neck on the gallows platform, still standing, weathered and half forgotten, at the north edge of town. He had spent 11 years building a quiet, respectable life on top of that memory, the way every son of every hanged man in Silverline had built a quiet, respectable life on top of it, and he stood now looking down at a Homestead Renewal that told him in his own new neighbor's careless handwriting that the hangman's daughter was living 11 miles from his front door. He said nothing to Ridge. He stamped the renewal, filed it, and told Ridge to have a fine evening in a voice gone thin and strange, and the moment Ridge's wagon cleared the edge of town, Vane Marlin closed his store 2 hours early, saddled his own horse for the first time in 3 years. They gathered that night in the back room of Bram Coswell's bank, Coswell himself, the richest man in the district and the son of Colonel Josephus Coswell, who had led the original claim-jumping syndicate and been the first of the 14, silent freighter named Silas Ordway, whose father had run the syndicate's stolen ore wagons before the rope caught up to him, the 2 Vance brothers, Emmett and Cole, whose father had been the syndicate's hired gun before he became one of its 14 dead, and 3 more men whose fathers had likewise swung from that same gallows beam. Sons who had grown into ranchers and freighters, and 1 more storekeeper, every one of them raised on the family understanding that the Rourke name, should it ever surface again in this district, was a threat to be answered before it could ever reach a federal courtroom a second time. Coswell laid it out cold and businesslike, the way he laid out every ledger in that bank, while Marlin paced the narrow room with his hat still on. 11 years I've held this county together, Coswell said. 11 years of every one of you sitting quiet in my back room, agreeing the past stayed buried so long as none of us went digging in it. Well, somebody's dug. Rourke's own blood is sitting 11 miles from this room right now, and I promise you, every one of you, if a federal land office ever gets a good look at how our fathers first came to hold this ground, you'll lose considerably more than your good name. Silas Ordway asked, low and flat, whether there wasn't some quieter way, money, a warning, a reason for the Calloways to simply move on. It was Marlin who answered him, his voice gone thin and hard with 11 years of watching his father's ghost sit at every family supper he'd ever eaten. There isn't a warning that unmakes what she already knows just by being born. There's only quiet, or there's the courthouse, and I, for one, am not spending what's left of my life waiting on a federal marshal's knock. It did not take much longer in that back room for grief and fear to curdle into something colder and more organized. If the hangman's daughter and her rancher husband were quietly gone from Silverline before word of her name spread any further, a wagon accident on the Ridge Road, a fire, a disappearance nobody in the county would trouble themselves to investigate too closely. 9 of them agreed to ride at first light to take the Calloway place before the household was even properly awake, and to leave nothing behind in that abandoned silver shaft on Silverline Ridge that any marshal, federal or otherwise, would ever trouble himself to dig up. They did not know, riding home from that meeting well past midnight, that a gray-headed stranger on an unhurried mule had crossed into the county that same evening, following 11 years of patient inquiry, and a rumor picked up 2 towns back about a rancher who'd married a woman with a hanged federal marshal's eyes. Ferrin reached the Calloway spread a little after 10 that night, Deacon plodding up the ranch road at the same unbothered pace he did everything, and found Ridge still awake on the porch, too wound up from the day's strange encounter at the mercantile to think about sleep. Ferrin didn't waste time on pleasantries. He told Ridge his name, told him he'd known Elowen's father, and asked, plain as a man asking after whether anything unusual had happened in town that day. And when Ridge described Vane Marlin's face going the color of old ash over a homestead form, Ferrin's own face went still and grim in a way that told Ridge, before a single further word was spoken, that whatever was coming fast. He asked for coffee, and there on the porch, with Elowen come to stand pale and listening in the doorway, Ferrin told them both the whole of it, the syndicate of 14 claim jumpers who'd seized the district by forgery and murder in the town's first 2 years. The 3 federal marshals they'd hanged from a cottonwood grove in '63 when the killings threatened to be discovered, and the commission that had finally, 4 years later, sent Josiah Rourke north with warrants for all 14. All 14 had hanged from the same gallows platform that still stood weathered and ignored, at the edge of town, and every prosperous family walking Silverline streets today, Ferrin told them. Unspoken vow that the Rourke name must never be allowed to surface here again. I came because I heard a rumor 2 towns back, and I didn't like the shape of it, Ferrin said, his voice low, and even despite the weight of what he was saying. I didn't expect to arrive the same night Marlin found out. That's bad luck, and it means we haven't got until morning to decide what to do about it. We've got until first light, and I'd bet my old mule they'll come before the sun's properly up, meaning to make you both disappear quiet enough that no marshal ever comes looking a second time. Ridge's hand found Elowen's in the dark of the doorway. How many men are we talking about, Ferrin? Enough that I'd have ridden clean past this ranch and straight for the county sheriff, if I believed for 1 minute the sheriff in this district answered to anybody but Bram Coswell's bank. So, we're not riding for help tonight. We're going to fortify what we've got, and we're going to be ready when they come, and I sent a wire a week back, on a hunch I'm awful glad now that I trusted, to the Territorial Marshal's office in Denver, asking 3 federal men to meet the stage into Silverline. If God's kind, they'll be here by tomorrow noon. Until then, it's the 3 of us, this house, and whatever's left of the night to get ready in. Enjoying this story? Hit the join button by the channel name to support the channel directly. It makes the next one possible. They worked through what remained of the darkness with the grim, wordless efficiency of people who understand exactly what's coming and have decided, every one of them, that running is no longer an option worth considering. Ferrin moved the horses into the timber a quarter-mile off so no stray shot could take them, checked every window and door for a clean line of sight, and laid out on the kitchen table by lamplight a rifle and a repeater and every box of cartridges the ranch owned, along with the battered saddlebag of federal filings, land office copies, and 11-year-old correspondence he'd carried across 4 territories, proof enough, if it survived the morning, to finish what Josiah Rourke had started. Elowen, whose hands had not stopped shaking since the porch conversation began, found somewhere in herself a steadiness she hadn't known she still owned, and spent the last hour before dawn loading and reloading cartridge boxes with the same careful, exacting patience her father had once brought to his own grim work. Watching her from across the table, said quietly that Josiah would have been proud to see his own steadiness living on in her hands. They came at first light, 9 riders moving up the ranch road out of a thin gray mist, Vane Marlin at their head with a shotgun across his saddle, and Bram Coswell close behind him. The rest strung out in a loose, confident line of men who had never once in 11 years of quiet, respectable living expected to find real resistance waiting on the far end of a morning's ugly errand. Ferrin was already at the front window with the repeater when the first rider crested the low-rise 200 yards out, and he did not wait for a parley that both of them already knew would only be a formality. Ridge Calloway. Marlin's voice carried thin across the cold morning air, pulling his horse up at 100 yards close enough to be heard, and he clearly believed, still far enough to be safe. This doesn't have to touch you. Send the woman out and you can keep your ranch and your peace, same as your uncle always had it. She's my wife. Marlin Ridge's voice, from the doorway, was steadier than he felt. That offer was never going to get a different answer than the one you're about to get. Marlin's arm came up, and 8 more hands moved toward 8 more guns, and it was Ferrin, from the window, who ended the parley the only way 11 years of patient waiting had taught him such men understood, a single shot that took the rifle clean out of the hands of the rider nearest Marlin's right before that man had even leveled it. Followed inside, 3 seconds by 3 more shots, each one dropping a horse or a rider with the flat, economical precision of a man who had done this kind of arithmetic more times in his life than he cared to count. 4 of the 9 were down or afoot inside the first 15 seconds, and the confident, loose line of riders broke apart into chaos. Men, wheeling their mounts for cover behind the barn, and the well house, returned fire chewing splinters out of the porch rail, and the window frame, kept a steady stream of reloaded cartridges moving into his hands without once letting her voice shake. It held that way for the better part of an hour. Emmett Vance tried twice to work his way along the fence line toward the barn's blind side, and twice Ferrin's rifle found him before he'd covered 30 feet. The second shot taking a chunk out of a fence post, so close to his ear that he crawled back to cover on his belly. Cole Vance, pinned behind the well house beside Marlin, kept shouting across the yard that they ought to fire the barn and smoke the whole household out, and it was Coswell, of all of them, crouched low behind an overturned watering trough with his fine banker's coat already torn at the shoulder, who shouted back that burning a homestead down around a woman while half the county could see the smoke from 3 ridges over was exactly the kind of evidence that would hang the lot of them for certain, and to hold his fire and wait. Inside the house, Ridge held the doorframe with a steadiness that surprised even himself, his rifle barrel resting on the splintered jamb, feeding on the strange, narrow calm that settles over a man once the waiting is finally over. Behind him, flat on the kitchen floor with cartridge boxes spread in a neat, deliberate row at her elbow, Elowen worked the reloading with hands gone perfectly steady, murmuring, half to herself and half to the ghost of a father she hadn't spoken of in 11 years, that she was not going to let this be the second time Rourke died for telling the truth. The founder's son stayed pinned in ragged cover around the yard, unwilling to charge a house defended by a man who'd already dropped 4 of them from 200 yards. Unwilling either to simply ride away and leave the job undone. It was Marlin, finally crouched behind the well house with his shotgun useless at that range, and 2 of his 9 already carried off bleeding by the men who'd stayed loyal enough to drag them clear, who called the retreat, shouting across the yard that they'd finished this proper with the whole town behind them. And not out here alone in a rancher's dooryard against a gun that shot like the devil himself was working the lever. They pulled back before the sun had fully cleared the ridge line, 5 men riding hard for town, dragging or carrying the 4 who couldn't ride themselves, and Ferrin, watching them go from the shattered front window, allowed himself one long breath before he turned to check that ridge. That bought us time. He set the repeater down, hands finally showing the smallest tremor of a man who had held himself iron, still through violence for far longer than his 46 years wanted to admit to. It didn't buy us the end of it. Marlin's going to ring that town bell inside the hour and try to raise every able-bodied man in Silverline against us, and some of them, God help this county, are going to answer that bell out of 11 years' worth of fear before anyone stops to ask whether fear is a good enough reason to ride against a woman who's done nothing but marry a decent man. The bell did ring, loud and urgent across the whole valley, and by mid-morning, a good portion of Silverline had gathered uneasily in the street outside the bank, Marlin bleeding from a graze along his jaw, and Coswell white-lipped with fury. Both men shouting that the town needed to finish what 9 of them had started before a federal marshal's daughter, and the old drifter protecting her brought the whole county's history down on every family's head. Word of what had happened at the ranch that morning had already reached the street in a dozen conflicting versions, some of them wild enough that a few of the gathered townsfolk half believed a whole company of federal soldiers had descended on the valley overnight, and it was into that confused, frightened crowd that Marlin and Coswell tried to press their case, counting on 11 years of buried guilt to do the persuading their own thin, bloodied appearance could not. But a bell rung in fear does not always summon the answer the ringer expects, and what Marlin found standing on the bank steps that morning was a town considerably less united behind him. Hollis Dray, who had refused all autumn to shoe Elowen's horse out of 11 years of inherited shame, stood at the edge of the gathered crowd with his blacksmith's arms folded and said, loud enough to carry, that he buried his own father's guilt quietly for 11 years, and he was not about to bury a rancher's wife on top of it. Reverend Teague, gray and shaking but resolute, planted himself bodily between Marlin's remaining riders and the road out to the Calloway ranch, and said he would stand there the rest of the day if that was what it took to keep this town from adding a second unforgivable morning to the first one. The crowd, uncertain, torn between 11 years of buried fear and the plain sight of a parson and a blacksmith refusing to move, did not ride. Marlin, seeing his posse dissolve into argument in the street, made the only choice left to a desperate man who has already committed every crime he can survive walking back from. He sent word out to the ranch, carried by a boy too young to understand what he was delivering. They could come to the town's original gallows platform at full dark and settle it there in the open in front of whatever part of Silverline still had the stomach to watch. A challenge Ferrin understood the moment he heard it, born less of courage than of a cornered man's last desperate hope, might still be twisted into something the town could forgive. Ferrin rode into Silverline, alone that evening, as the light went long and gold over the ridgeline in the whole town, word having spread through every household by then, gathered at a careful, frightened distance around the weathered old platform at the north edge of the street. Josiah Rourke had stood delivering federal sentence to 14 guilty men. He carried the saddlebag of documents slung across one shoulder and a lantern in his free hand, and he climbed the platform's rotted steps and stood, in the fading light, exactly where his old partner had once stood, and he did not raise his voice because he had learned across 11 long years of patient searching that a truth spoken calm and plain carries further into a frightened crowd than any shout ever could. Most of you know why I've come, even if you've spent 11 years telling yourselves you didn't. His voice carried flat and clear across the hushed street. In 1863, a syndicate of 14 men led by Colonel Josephus Coswell hanged 3 federal marshals from a cottonwood grove above this town to keep the truth of their forged land claims buried. In 67, Josiah Rourke came here under federal commission and answered that murder the lawful way on this platform, and every one of you standing in this street tonight either is or is married to or works for the son of one of those 14 men. His daughter married a rancher in this valley 6 months ago. in perfect innocence, never knowing this was the town her father's rope had marked. And this morning, 9 of your neighbors rode out to murder her in her own home and bury her where no one would ever find the body, because they'd rather kill an innocent woman than let this town's whole prosperity be traced back to the murder that built it. A murmur moved through the crowd, the low, uneven sound of a town's long-buried conscience finally coming loose all at once, and it was into that murmur that Vane Marlin stepped forward from the shadow of the bank building. Shotgun set aside now, his pistol drawn instead, his face gone past fear into the flat, desperate calculation of a man with nothing left to lose. You don't get to stand where the hangman stood and lecture this town, old man. Marlin's voice cracked on the word man. My father built this town before your friend ever rode in to murder him for it. Your father built this town on 3 dead marshals and forged paper, Marlin, and you spent 11 years knowing it, same as I've spent 11 years proving it. Ferrin set the lantern down slow, his free hand easy at his side, his whole stance gone into that same coiled, unhurried stillness Ridge had seen on the porch that morning. You rode out this morning to finish what your father started. I'd think hard before you finish it here, in front of this whole street, with your hand already on that pistol. Marlin did not think hard enough. His hand finished the motion before his better sense could catch up to it, and Ferrin, 46 years old, gray-headed, riding a mule that looked half asleep, and faster in that single necessary heartbeat than any man in that crowd would have believed, drew and fired a fraction of a second before Marlin's own shot went wide into the gallows timber above Ferrin's head. Marlin went down on the packed dirt of the street he'd spent his whole life defending with silence, and the 7 remaining founders' sons standing scattered through the crowd, watching their last and loudest defender fall, let their own hands drop away from their belts one by one, all at once, run out of secrets left to protect. Elowen herself climbed the platform steps, then past Ferrin, past Marlin's still body, and stood for the first time in her life in the exact spot her father had once stood delivering federal sentence. Tad, with Ridge's hands steady at the base of the steps, and the whole of Silverline, finally looking directly at her instead of past her. My father never once told me what happened in this town, she said, her voice carrying clear and unshaking across the hushed street, because he believed a man ought to carry his own hard duty quietly and not burden his family with it. I have spent 11 years believing his name was something to hide. I am done hiding it. Whatever this town decides to do with what it knows now, it will not be able to say again that it never knew. A long silence followed, broken only by the wind moving through the cottonwoods above the old placer diggings, and in that silence more than one face in the crowd went from fear to something closer to shame, and then, slower still, to something that might, given time, grow into respect. Bram Coswell tried, for one last desperate moment, to rally what remained of the crowd's fear against Ferrin and against Ridge, who had ridden in behind him with Elowen at his side. But a crowd that has just watched its most fervent defender die in the open street for a lie carries considerably less appetite for further violence than a crowd whispering behind closed doors, and Coswell's shouted threats died away into the same uneasy silence Marlin's had. Stepping up onto the platform beside Ferrin, with his hands raised for quiet, who spoke the words that finally, completely, broke the town's 11 years of buried shame wide open. I have carried the guilt of half this congregation in confidence for 10 years, and I am done carrying it in silence. Everything the old man has said tonight is true, and I believe most of you standing in this street have known it in your bones, since long before he ever climbed up on that platform to say it plain. It is past time this town stopped being ashamed of what its fathers did and started being honest enough to make what amends can still be made. The stage rolled into Silverline a little before noon the next day, 3 federal marshals aboard, summoned by Ferrin's week-old wire, and arriving at the precise, unhurried moment a man who trusted his own hunches had counted on all along. For all its slowness, genuinely just. The surviving founder's sons, Coswell, and 6 others, the 8 who had ridden out that dawn and lived to answer for it, were arraigned as accessories to a conspiracy of concealment and fraud. Their own fathers had begun in 1863, and for the attempted murder of a rancher and his wife in their own home, a crime the law could reach cleanly, regardless of what history stood behind it. The Territorial Land Office, working from the very documents Ferrin had carried 400 miles in a battered saddlebag, opened a formal review of Silverline's original claims, and reached a settlement that let honest families keep the homes and businesses they'd built in good faith while stripping Coswell's fraud-inflated fortune down to something considerably closer to what honest work would have earned him. Coswell himself, convicted that winter on the attempted murder charge alone, was sentenced to 12 years at the Territorial Penitentiary, and the bank he'd run on borrowed authority was placed, by court order, under honest management for the first time since his father had helped forge the district into existence. Emmett and Cole Vance, the least committed of the 9 riders and the first to lay down their arms once Marlin fell, testified for the prosecution in exchange for lighter sentences. That finally closed the 11-year-old question of who had truly given the order to hang 3 federal marshals in that cottonwood grove back in '63. Silas Ordway served 4 years and came home a quieter, humbler man who took to leaving fresh flowers, without ever once explaining why to anyone who asked, at the foot of the old gallows platform every spring for the rest of his life. Elowen gave the town what time it needed to finish coming apart at its own long-buried seams, because she had decided in the course of that terrible dawn and longer terrible night, something about her own life she intended to carry the rest of it, that a name kept in silence and shame, in front of the whole town that owed it an accounting, as a chance, given patience, to heal into something closer to honor. By the following spring, when Silverline held a special town meeting to elect a clerk to keep the county's land and water records honestly for the first time since the town's founding, the vote for Elowen Calloway came back unanimous, every hand raised without a single holdout, and it was the town's first genuine act of legitimate self-government since the Syndicate of 14 had first forged its way into existence 17 years before. She took the position seriously in a way that surprised even Ridge, who had married a quiet seamstress from Denver and found himself, within a single autumn, married instead to the woman who kept the most honest ledger of land and water rights the county had seen in a generation, i.e., the household of a man who believed careful, exacting honesty was the one true mercy a hard country owed its people, and who had finally, after 11 years of running from that inheritance, old Ferrin stayed through that first winter mending harness and splitting wood and teaching Ridge, in the unhurried evenings by the stove, things about patience and old grief no younger man could have taught him. Come spring, he saddled Deacon one gray morning at first light, refused every offer Ridge and Elowen made to keep him on his family, and told them only that a man who had spent 11 years finishing one promise to a dead friend had earned the right to spend whatever years he had left, simply riding. He rode out of Silverline the same slow, unbothered way he'd ridden in, and if the town noticed him go, it noticed was something entirely different from the fear that had greeted his arrival, a quiet, grateful respect for the old gray gunslinger who had crossed 400 miles and stood alone in a doorway at dawn. To make certain a dead man's daughter never had to stand there by herself again. Ridge walked with him as far as the ridge road that morning and asked him, before they parted, whether he intended to ever settle anywhere for good, and Ferrin only laughed, a dry, unhurried sound Ridge hadn't heard from him once in the whole of that hard week, and said that a man who'd spent 11 years keeping one promise had earned the right to spend the rest of his life without another one weighing on him, though he supposed if a letter ever found him care of a Denver post office, he wouldn't mind hearing how the ranch and the ledger. Elowen thought of her father often in the years that followed, but differently than she had for 11 long hiding years before. Not as ashamed to be buried, but as a man whose exacting, careful honesty had against every hard year in between. She kept framed above the small desk in the county clerk's office the single surviving photograph of Josiah Rourke she owned, taken the year before Cheyenne, his face solemn and steady in the way she remembered it best, and more than one visitor to that office over the years. Asked whether the man in the photograph was kin, she always answered the same way, without a trace of the old flinch that question had once cost her. Yes, she would say, my father. And she would tell them, if they had the patience to sit and listen, exactly who he was. A year later, on the anniversary of that terrible dawn, the town held a small unofficial gathering at the old gallows platform. Not to mourn, exactly, and not to celebrate, but simply to stand together in the place their history had happened and admit out loud one more time, Hollis Dray brought a wagon load of fresh-cut lumber that spring and, with Ridge and half a dozen other men working alongside him, quietly rebuilt the platform's rotted rail, not to preserve it as a monument to hanging, but because that a town, too ashamed to even maintain the ground its history stood on, would never fully finish healing from it. Elowen kept the county's ledgers with the same exacting care her father had once brought to warrants and sentences, and more than one old-timer in Silverline remarked, in the years that followed, that there had never been a clerk in that county's history, and Silverline itself, that had spent 11 years pretending its own founding had never happened, spent every year afterward doing something it had never once managed before Elowen Calloway rode into its silence and refused in the end to keep quiet about who she was. The way Ridge liked to say, a town, like a marriage, like a person, only ever gets to heal once it finally stops running from the truth of what made it.